All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Greg. How are you doing, Greg?
Doing all right, man. Glad to be with you.
Well. This is exciting because this year, during the Advent class with Dom Crossan, we were looking at the Christmas stories. And so often when we do these homebrewed classes, you get thousands of people ready to nerd out around a topic. And then they send me these emails. They say, Trip, I don't know how to use the technology. So I respond to those. Then you send these Trip, I was doing the reading. Can you do a question about this? Or I had this idea. Can you do this? And I'm reading all these emails, but then I get these other kind where they're like, look, my brain is exploding in excitement. I have new questions and doubts and things over here. I have all these new ideas I'm starting to play with. Like, how do I process them spiritually? And I say, well, I already got these other emails. Maybe you should talk to your friends. And then I moved to Greensboro. And guess who my neighbor is, Greg?
That's it. Who? Is
Greg,
it possibly me?
It's you. Yeah.
It's me. Just down the street. Just down the street.
Who happens to run Second Breath. And when we were hanging out, having some high quality craft beer brought by Homebrewed Christianity listeners, when I saw them in Napa, California, they brought Pliny the Elder, greatest IPA of the West Coast.
Amazing.
I said, Greg, we got to try this. Taunt our mutual friend Josh.
We did.
From Rethinking Faith.
He was incredibly jealous.
And
felt good.
And then you told me that Second Breath has an app.
Yep.
You have this you've shifted as a community to online space.
Yep.
And I said, maybe you could remedy my problem. And you said, no, I'm not doing tech emails. I said, all right, but what about helping people with spirituality? Right. So we're here. We're giving an invitation in this to one, join the class if you want to. Go to Crossing Through Advent, where you'll get to nerd out all the Bible stuff and everything, and we'll have some contemplative resources and interaction and that kind of stuff as well this time. But also, if you are sitting there like, whoa, I need no extra nerdery during Advent, they can also go check out Second Breath, the app, and all the Advent meditations and things through it. So maybe the place to begin is for you to give us a heads up as to what it is you and Second Breath are kind of adding on, extending to the normal kind of nerdery we do in the classes.
Yeah, well, Second Breath's been around for about 30 years. And for most of that time, we had a Greensboro-based campus where we did in-person classes and workshops. We really focused on teachings and spiritual practices that would lead us to an embodied faith or an embodied spirituality. And what I mean by that embodiment is, I believe in the West, we are just profoundly head-centric, that, we are Aristotelian. We are raised in a fish tank where we really believe that the head and understanding something is the most important. And in no way am I negating the beauty of the mind, but it is limited in its power to actually experience transformation. I mean, most people I know can write dissertations on the love of God or their parent issues or anything like that, but knowledge alone never changes us. We don't experience change by information alone. And so we want to invite people to make a shift into what Richard Rohr defines this way. He says, how do we shift from mere intellectual systems of doctrine to actual inner experience? How do we shift from being able to write a dissertation on the love of God to an actual inner experience of that divine presence that's closer than our thoughts and closer than our breath? And what we found is shifting people, especially through spiritual practice. And I would broaden it just from the contemplative. I love the contemplative, but I think that even often in our Christian cultural context, contemplative mainly just appeals to like introverts and to people that don't have ADHD and that are comfortable sitting in stillness. And I'm none of those things. I feel like in the contemplative tradition, which I'm not negating, but again, I think it's too small. We're attempting to take the monastic life and then microdose it into our busy schedules. And it doesn't really effectively work that way. So really the invitation is, how do we step off of the hamster wheel? How do we step out of autopilot where we function most of the time to actually land in the present moment and get in touch with not only the brilliance of our minds, but our hearts and our bodies? And we have found over and over again through blending rich teaching from our Christian tradition with peer-reviewed modern science. And that especially there's so much amazing studies now on the impact of mindfulness meditation on the brain, on the nervous system, on the body. And so we craft these spiritual practices that are a blend of both our rich Christian tradition and peer-reviewed modern science to shift us again from mere intellectual belief systems to actual inner experience. And we can say in all the years that we've been teaching this, that anyone who's put these practices into place in their life, and it doesn't mean you have to, sell your belongings, sleep on a mat by yourself, and do this for hours a day. That some of these, they're really simple to begin to fold into our busy lives.
Yeah.
Some of them, you can just be in the middle of a meeting and just doing a particular breath modality, which we know scientifically will calm your, shift you from your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system, where you can actually relax. We teach practices where we can watch brain activity shift away from that primitive fight or flight amygdala to the parts of the brain that regulate self-awareness and compassion.
Yeah.
And the great science here is that finally the sciences are catching up to what the Christian mystics have been saying for centuries. And what these, St. John of the Cross is saying with his struggles, or St. Francis, or Hilary of Bingham, and all of these amazing folks that were kind of outliers within their centuries, that we see now that modern science is explaining what's happening in the body, in the brain, and why it shifts us to an embodied spirituality. So that's our passion. That's our passion.
Yeah. So, one of the things I'm excited about is, like, and even hearing the story of Second Breath, is having had this long history of kind of a local community. It was developed out of a Episcopal congregation, and then has expanded to include a whole diversity of religious traditions within the Greensboro area. But in lockdown and all that, kind of, y'all took that moment to shift to a larger vision. Like, how can the practices and things we've learned in community locally become a gift to people abroad? And so y'all developed the app, where there's all sorts of different kind of what would you call them, spiritual tracks,
spiritual practices,
and different kind of sequences of things. But you can all go see. We'll link to the app, whether you use Google or have an iPhone and such. But during Advent, you've been working on a particular kind of a track of reflections to follow along with the things we're doing in the class. So kind of describe for those that, let's say, I don't know, you're a theological podcaster, hypothetical, and you like the idea of deep religious experience. In fact, you love reading about it, and talking about it. Even. This hypothetical individual, what if they're okay? I mean, I like the idea of it. Maybe I'll download the app and look at it. But what is the gift to the kind of nerd, who is doing something like this, that that you hope what your team and everyone's building? What is it giving? What is the invitation that it has?
Right. I mean, I do think pretty much if you're in the West, then we're going to prefer the mind. And then some of us, I think, are just more academically oriented. And so in some ways that we're drawn to that space of intellectual understanding. And again, that's fantastic. But I think that in addition to, again, it's not minimizing the brilliance of the brain, but how do we actually take those truths to land in our lives, in our hearts, in our bodies, in a way that we experience authentic transformation from the inside out? In many ways, I think this is why people are leaving the church in droves, statistically, across every measurement. I think because where's the transformation of communities? Where's the transformation of lives? It says we're going to experience this, but it's not there. And so in many ways, this is inviting us to what I believe is the fullness of life that Jesus of Nazareth taught and embodied. So it's a holistic approach to our spirituality. It's not new. The newness we're adding is the peer-reviewed science, but it's been being taught in different aspects of our faith for millennia. But the app in particular is our labor of love. Creating an app's like having a baby. Once you have it, that's when the work begins, in terms of maintaining it and continuing to add new content. But it's got hundreds of spiritual practices from 3 minutes long to 25 minutes long. And they're organized by head, heart, and body. Again, this is research-based organization of what lands in your body, help you to ground your body, embrace your body, what helps open your heart and kind of release that, what helps quiet and calm your mind. And then we also have a section where we have our series, where we have conversations similar to a podcast with folks there. And then we'll create specific series like again, faith and science, where we or forgiveness, where we'll typically take a Stanford-based researcher who looked at the impact of forgiveness on the body, and then blend that with the teachings of Bishop Desmond Tutu, who embodied forgiveness in apartheid South Africa. And then we create a 5 or 7 part series to guide people deeper into that practice of forgiveness. Now, for this class, we've created a specific Advent series to go along. And if you go into the series section, it includes just a brief kind of nesting teaching. And by brief, I mean less than a minute or a minute or so, and then lead it into a practice specifically about that aspect. So it's very accessible. It's not a huge commitment of time. And we do that on purpose. But again, the science says it doesn't really take much time for there to be a shift in your brain and in your body.
So, one of the things I'm excited about is, you were at Theology Beer Camp a couple of weeks ago, and there all of a sudden there's like this 250 people that listen to different podcasts that are there, and a lot of them are trying to figure out faith. They're like, I love Jesus. I'm trying to work this out. His institutional friends not wonderful all the time, and there are lots of places that you can live in the country where there's not a community that's like, I follow Jesus, and that means I also care about the planet, the poor, and all these other kinds of things.
You feel very alone. And I had a lot of those conversations at beer camp.
And so, like, to me, after that, realizing how, which is essentially, Homebrewed, it's like literally, if you were to think of what is the most intellectually nerdy religion podcast, like the only time it borders on something that's not nerdy is if I'm inebriated enough and start preaching, right? And then I still
I've seen that. I've been there.
I still use language that requires a graduate degree. So, but that all the people came there and then are reading all the responses. It's like, I knew I was a part of the community because I have these kind of questions and they matter. And it was the meaningful part was connecting. So this, to me, why I'm excited about it is, for not everyone in the class has to do it, and some people that aren't in the class can still join, is what would it be like to have these little moments and little practices during Advent, where for those of us that may not have an on-the-ground community, there's a couple thousand people attempting to not just dig deep and nerd out information-wise with Crossing, which kind of is like
awesome.
Probably literally the most cool person to get to do that with.
Amazing. Ridiculous.
But what happens if, while we're wrestling with this information and this vision, we also ask, how can it transform us? And not be stuck doing it alone. Know that we're doing these practices together. And during the class and such, Greg and I are going to have coffee and hang out with any of those who are doing that spiritual practice and stuff through Advent. Before you took over Second Breath, you started in the PCA, Presbyterian Church, the most angry version of the
very
Calvinists.
very angry. Yes, I was ordained a PCA pastor initially,
and then you became an Episcopal priest,
right?
And then the contemplative mystical side of Episcopalian priest, which basically means you're a free agent.
Free agent. Yeah. Well, the Episcopal umbrella is pretty big. So I have a lot of latitude and flexibility.
So I say all that because everyone that comes in class could be coming from different places, from the first step out of a very small box to the first time you did prayer with a group of people because you're so post-religious, or you're interested in Jesus, but are confessionally Buddhist or whatnot.
Right.
Both of us are very comfortable with people in all sorts of places on the religious tradition.
Absolutely.
So the fun thing I'm looking forward to in hearing from people that are doing the practice and in our conversations is, what happens when the only thing we know we hold in common is we've decided to do these practices and talk about it together. As opposed to, we show up at this church,
right? That's creedal based. And I would say, and this is not a plug for the Episcopal Church at all, but I would say, in the Episcopal Church, we call ourselves the people of the book, and by that we actually don't mean the Bible. We actually mean the Book of Common Prayer, and in that, which of course, like a huge percentage of it is actually just Scripture. But the idea is we don't define ourselves creedally. That we don't say you have to believe this to be a part of us. That what defines our community is that we worship together. And that it is this experience of worship and prayer together that defines the contours of our community. And I love that as we shift away, personally in my own journey, from a real creedal based system where you're inherently, it's us, them, in, out,
Mhm.
versus coming together as fellow humans trying to experience the journey, and what is fullness of life and how do I live fully, from the inside out. And then I just find, I mean, that's what at Second Breath classes, we would have conservative evangelicals sitting next to a Buddhist.
Mhm.
And we would find that we weren't trying to convince them of any doctrine, but inviting them to in this experience and an expansive perspective of the faith journey. And we would have just amazing conversations when you're not based creedally and trying to determine who's in and who's out, but you're creating space for authentic experience to grow in awareness that we're already immersed in divine love and presence. And we're intimately connected with one another,
Yeah.
with the cosmos. Once we grow in that awareness, kind of these other things that have kept us divided begin to fall away. And like you're saying, like a beer camp, I can't tell you how many people I talked to, Trip. And this is one of the things I was just so stoked about you creating that space, is people felt like it was home. Like people felt at home in that community for the first time. I heard that from a dear friend of mine who said, this is the first time I felt truly at home in my faith journey with a group of people, which of course is what we'd love for church to be.
Yeah.
But it happened at beer camp in Chapel Hill.
Well, I mean, it's nothing like day drinking with some liberal Lutherans.
Well, they do create a solid foundation for authentic connection. But I think that space of, and again, Second Breath at its best, while we love the teaching and we're really passionate about the spiritual practices, when we were in person, it was the table groups, the communities, that authentic connection. So having a space for people to share their authentic connection, their experience together, I think that's where there's real power. I mean, I think one of the most powerful forces in the world in terms of life transformation is you being vulnerable and seen in your vulnerability and accepted in your vulnerability. That's just power.
Yeah.
I mean, that just changes a person intrinsically. And so that's the invitation, I would say, from this. This creates a space, an experiential space of authentic connection, which is, I think, where the good stuff is.
Mhm. So, why Second Breath? Like, where's the where was the first breath? Is this like Second Baptist Church?
Yeah, that's exactly
because
right.
there was
first breath we had to, there was another.
We split off.
We split off from those first breathers. I don't even want to talk about.
They're like, look, we're not even going to finish exhaling.
That's right. I'm going to pass out before I end this first. So so there was the title came from, actually, there's a priest that was teaching at a workshop or teaching a workshop at this particular conference. And he was scheduled to do a workshop at one end of the conference. And then the talk went over a little bit and people were asking questions, and he had to get to his second workshop all the way at the other end of the conference center. So he's in his collar, and he's got all of his notes, and he's running across, and this is a true story, and he's running across the conference center, in harried, busy, I'm sure, to teach about the love and patience of God. And he smashes his knee on a table, and he yells out in front of all the people that are there. He yells out, "God damn it!" In
Yikes.
front of everybody. And he kind of paused and he said, okay, well, I guess in some sense that's kind of a prayer. And then he said with his first breath, he realized it was reactive. His first breath, he couldn't do much with his first breath. It's just anytime there's a negative stimulation, it's going to trigger an initial reaction. He said, but it was his second breath. It was an opportunity for a whole new way to respond, a whole new way to view. So he said with his first breath, it was kind of this reactive, angry, flustered reality. And with his second breath, it was kind of the doorway or a portal to a whole new perspective. So he said with his second breath, he was blessing all those who were harried and frustrated just like himself. And so that little story, we loved it so much that the idea of at every moment is, we know that we're always going to have negative stimulation. It triggers our amygdala, the fight or flight part of the brain. We know that scientifically. But we do have the invitation anytime we're dealing with frustration or hardship or sadness or grief or loneliness or all the experiences of life. With our second breath, we're invited to shift out of autopilot and kind of land in our bodies and our hearts and respond from our true self, in the language of Thomas Merton. And so that invitation to our true self is literally there with every single second breath of the day. So we love that poetic articulation of the invitation to shift from autopilot to functioning out of an embodied spirituality.
Yeah. Oh no, I think that's really helpful, because there is I think there's a growing awareness that the world we live in resists us having the power of taking a second breath.
Right.
If you think of the way our um, the way we've connected to technology,
Oh,
the way
yeah.
our anxiety and fears are being dealt with,
Yep.
the way we were not even evolved to be aware of tragedies across a globe,
Right.
and now we are.
Yep.
If you think of the way our economic system, it says get more efficient,
Yep.
do more faster.
Yep.
If we think of our anxiety as parents,
Yep.
we're like, okay, I'm not sure the rat race I've been running has led to flourishing, but I can't even imagine another live option. So let me help my kids learn to succeed at this game that's killing me.
Right.
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 So much
Yep.
of like everything around us
Yep.
is don't take is built to never have us take a second breath.
Right.
It's just a series of responsive first breaths.
Right.
And and yeah, anyway, I think that's such a great image. And even though the priest ruined his witness by cursing,
or established his credibility with the people that
really
needed it.
depends on who you're
It
talking
really depends on
to.
who you're talking to. Yeah, yeah. That piece, I really do think that we are so bombarded to then, and the Buddhists call it live in the monkey mind.
Mhm.
Thomas Keating described it as ordinary awareness, but that's where we just function, and we think we're our thoughts, and we are living in this hamster wheel of reactivity, and we don't realize there's a way off.
Right.
And our culture certainly doesn't provide it. Our culture reinforces and calcifies this as a means of freedom, which it never delivers. And to me, again, rich in our tradition, and I believe this is exactly what Jesus of Nazareth taught and embodied. Come to me, all you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I think there's this invitation off the hamster wheel, which existed in every form, every time there's been an empire. In every times, right? It's not brand new. I just think we're taking it to a new level with technology. But this really is the invitation to sanity, to real soul rest, to actually living in a way that we experience and offer love. And not that we can't when we're in monkey mind or living, on the hamster wheel, but it is a real shift to a deeper, in Keating's language again, spiritual awareness, and to live much more out of that whole new lens on life.
Yeah. So when I think that's really helpful. I know a lot of psychologists draw a distinction between kind of fast and slow thinking, right?
That's interesting.
Where there's a kind of intentionality behind the thinking, because what we've learned through the psychological sciences is that we are really good at giving well-crafted explanations for what are our kind of impulsive responses and reasonings generated by our unexamined desires. Right? Like we whatever we do or say, respond in whatever kind of immediate way, and then we tell a story where it makes perfect sense that we responded that way. And I know for me, it often and I know your children are older than mine, but it often shows up when you act a fool as a parent.
Yeah.
And like, oh, you've had a frustrating day. I don't know. Let's imagine a whole bunch of people sent you emails asking you to explain technology. This is a joke, by the way. If you have, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's not personal. But and you cut and pasted, or like when I was teaching, cut and pasted from a syllabus to the student's email.
Yep.
And you're like, do you remember when I had you initial each page of the syllabus after you read it?
Yeah.
And now you're asking me a question that's in there, and I just cut and paste. Anyway, you have a number, and you're getting a little frustrated.
Yeah.
And you come home, and you're like, and then I don't know. Let's say a 5-year-old acts like a 5-year-old, or an 8-year-old acts like an 8-year-old, or a 14-year-old acts like a 14-year-old, and you're not there for it.
Right.
You're like, what? And whatever your immediate response is, was like you somehow or feel safe enough in this space to let out the frustration and anger that are there. And then you get in this moment where you look at their face looking at you going like, Dad was kind of a judgmental asshat. And I so often catch myself doing, well, if you had just, and what I'm about to say is, I too recognize it's embarrassing for me to be this frustrated, angry, and respond this way, but I am going to tell you a story that you're technically responsible for my immature actions. It's
Right.
like that second breath image, that like shifting from fast thinking to slow thinking
Yeah.
is something that has tangible material impact
Yeah.
on the people we love, our neighbors, and possibly if you ever get around to praying for your enemies,
That's
even
right.
how we relate to them. And now that the election's over, maybe I'll do it.
Yeah, maybe you get a
We'll
few of
see.
those, shoot those prayers up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really to me, it's less about, so much of the time, and I feel like we can weaponize morality. We can certainly weaponize spiritual practice and meditation to try
Mhm.
to force us to be good people according to some particular compass of that I'm supposed to present this way. And this really is, in the words of Thomas Keating, when you create this space off the hamster wheel, he calls it divine therapy.
Yeah.
Where oftentimes the stuff that we have been ignoring, the stuff that maybe we've been intentionally ignoring for a lifetime,
Mhm.
begins to bubble up. And one question that we have from people that come through it is like, why would I want to do that? I think it was Annie Dillard who said, in the depths are the monsters that psychiatrists have warned you about. And so it's kind of like people that wake up in the middle of the night and rarely their thoughts are sweet and kind and encouraging, right? It's when the stuff bubbles up. And but what we know is that all that unexamined stuff is radically impacting every millisecond of your day, your experience of every millisecond. And there was a great story briefly by Parker Palmer, where he's a great contemplative
Mhm.
author, and he wrote about, he was terrified of heights, so he decided to go rappelling because he wanted to kind of face his fear. So, and this is a true story, he gets on the rock face, it's about 100 feet up in the air, and they're having him begin to step down the cliff face slowly, and he's about 10 feet off the top of the cliff top when he looks down. The instructor told him not to look down. He looks down and he literally is frozen in fear. I mean, absolutely frozen. And he says, "You have to come get me." And the guy up top said, "Dude, there's this outward bound guy's like, dude, you're not going to be able to. Can't come get you. You need to keep walking." He's like, "That's not an option. I cannot keep walking." And at that point, he heard the instructor yell out the outward bound motto, which was, "Look, man, if you can't get out of it, get into it." Which, of course, at that moment in Parker's consciousness was like, that is trite crap. That is silliness. If you can't get out of it, get into it. But soon it sunk down into him. Like, there's no helicopter pulling him off that wall.
Yeah.
He's got to get down. And so it became this, if I can't get out of it, get into it. And soon, metabolizing that reality, his feet started shuffling down and he made it down safely. And that's the reality of our inner life. If we can't get out of it, it's impacting our every millisecond of every day. And if we can't get out of it, we might as well begin to get into it. And the stuff that bubbles up, and I've been doing this for many years, and I'm still shocked by some of the big stuff that bubbles up through my life. And I was like, damn, I thought I had a handle on that a long time ago. I'm like, dude, I don't even have close to a handle. And so it's not about getting it right, but I do believe it's about genuine, authentic presence and the ability to see and accept ourselves for who we really are. And then we do that for others too. Once we begin to see, wow, there's a whole lot of complexity in here. I'm certainly not the moral giant that I thought I was. And what does it mean for us to then really grow in acceptance and then offer that to others? And so we see the transformation, not so much in behavioral modification, although that's often a side effect, but really it's authentic seeing, knowing, and feeling accepted from the inside out. And again, that's where there's real power and transformation. And that changes
Yeah.
how you respond to your kid. Even if you do mess up with your kid, then you can sit down and say, "Buddy, I'm so sorry."
Yeah.
And which is, I grew up in a place where, dad never apologized for anything. And so what does it mean to model that and go to your kids and say, "I'm really sorry I did that. I lost my temper and I was taking it out on you." That changes a kid.
Yeah.
That changes the whole family energy.
Yeah.
So it's that practical. It
Oh.
sounds esoteric, but it's that practical down to the
Mhm.
daily moment by moment interactions.
So I think that's a great invitation. And I want to make sure a few things in. I have 3 questions people sent in that were very intro-y questions.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about those. But before that, I want to make sure everyone knows we'll link on the blog post for this, where you can click over and get the app. You can do all the Advent meditation. You don't have to subscribe or anything to access
It's all free access
any of
to
it.
the Advent.
If you want to join the class, it's crossinthroughadvent.com. During class, we will on Tuesdays, we'll have it's Mondays. Mondays is Hangout with Dom. He'll do the visual lecture and all that kind of stuff. And then at the end of the week, we will Greg and I will get together and discuss those people that are on the spiritual journey and such with it as well. And if you're in the class and have questions, we'll be sending an email with the kind of details of how you, for those that may not have used an app before or are trying to figure out a new one and such, we'll make sure to send you all the info so you can do it, and then just reach out if you have questions. All right, here we go. Now, let's do Sally's question. This is a fun one. I haven't prayed in years. So what is prayer?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I have a very different definition. When I was younger, when I was an evangelical especially, I thought prayer was predominantly a cognitive activity. It was adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, acts. And I'm not minimizing that. I do think that can be an expression of prayer. The older I get, I find myself using less and less words. In fact, I often find that words get in the way. Now, if I go to an Episcopal service and we're using the liturgy, I'm praying through that. And those ancient prayers are beautiful. And sometimes I find that written prayers or spontaneous prayers bubble up out of me. But I would say overall, I believe that there's no separation from God. We are, in Paul's language to the Athenian philosophers, in God we live and move and have our being. I mean, that's a language of immersion, and that's a language of saturation.
Yeah.
So the idea that I've got to communicate something verbally, cognitively, I think is dissonant with that reality. And in fact, I would say some of my moments of deepest connection, even with other people, are when we're having a shared experience, like maybe the sunset is so gorgeous that we're sitting in silence listening to it, and words would actually create a block to a deep connection. And so I find that silence actually is prayer. So when people say, when they used to ask me when I was an evangelical, how's your prayer life? And it would immediately trigger anxiety, regret. It sucks. I'm trying to work on it. I'm going to do more discipline. I'm going to start a prayer journal. And now it's like, nothing is not prayer. If we are immersed in divine presence, and simply the only thing that's lacking in that moment, if I feel isolated, is my awareness of that connection. So me simply being me in the moment is intimately at every moment a shared experience with the divine. There's no moment that is not spiritual.
It's a dispositional type of thing.
I would say that even the reality is, even if I'm not aware of it, that I'm never not, I mean, literally my existence is in intimate connection with the divine. And so I would say, in terms of our cognitive process of growing in awareness of that, yes, when I choose to sit and be still, or sit and literally, I'll just take a leaf off of a tree and I'll just contemplate that sucker for 5 minutes. And by the end, my mind is blown by the complexity and beauty of the cosmos. I might just be, I had one spiritual directee that I remember that we were talking, and he said he said he didn't pray. He said, I asked him about his spiritual life. He said it's Sunday mornings, and he said occasionally, a couple times I prayed during the week. So he had defined the categories of spirituality within these tiny confines, like a tiny little drawer, and the rest of his life was the dresser. And I asked him, I said, what do you love to do? And he said, I thought he was going to say ride a bike or go hiking. He said, I love to eat chocolate pudding. And I was like, all right, dude. I was like, well, here's your assignment before our next session. I said, when I want you to sit down. He said, every night he gets a cup of chocolate pudding, the kind with a little tin foil.
Oh, yeah.
And he says he just sits down and eats it, and he loves it. I said, so this is your assignment, that before every time you sit down with that cup of chocolate pudding, I want to get you to give it your undivided attention. I mean, the sound of the tinfoil peeling off, when you lick the lid, and then the clink of the spoon, or the clunk on the plastic sides, and then all the way down to that last spoonful that you put it in your mouth, and really savor it. And at the end of that time, I'd like you to say, thank you, God, for this perfect time of prayer. And he said, are you saying that eating chocolate pudding is spiritual? And I said, absolutely. Absolutely. I said, do you know how much God is enjoying you enjoying that pudding? Do you think about the complexity of you enjoying the present moment is in the capacity of living in growing awareness of our connection with the divine? The idea of spiritualizing it. When people say, I've never had a spiritual experience, the question to me is, what are the parameters defining what that is? Because to me, living fully present, living in the present moment is going to grow us in awareness of that. It's not saying I've got to say the name of Jesus or I've got to say amen. It is simply the capacity to live in the present moment. And when you look at these threads of almost all of these wisdom traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Sufism or Christianity, they begin to sound very similar in terms of their capacity to invite us to live in the present moment.
Mhm.
So I would say, in my definition, that that it's growing in awareness of our already existing connection, and that prayer for me, very rarely, honestly, I hardly ever pray with words. And I'm praying right now. I can't not. So I would just say it's an awareness of the inherent connection and immersion. I would say saturation. Right now, we're saturating in divine love and presence, and the spiritual journey is simply growing in awareness of this already existing connection that's been there the whole time.
You know, one of the things in that kind of shift of thinking of prayer primarily as an activity you know occasionally do
Right.
and occasionally don't, to a kind of a pious disposition to the world that you learn to cultivate. So
Yeah.
you're present in prayer, like obviously, like when you get Paul saying pray without ceasing, it's not because he actually had imagined you walking around doing Our Fathers all day long.
Right.
Um,
I tried that when I was a young
oh,
evangelical. It
you
did not lead to a good, healthy mental state. I can tell you that.
but sometimes I think, or at least this has been my experience, is that sometimes when you have blocks
Yeah.
for opening up to that, one of the gifts religious traditions give, or it are those old written prayers,
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
right? So
Beautiful.
especially, I'm guessing, having some familiarity with Sally, having, if you come out of a very conservative religious context,
Yeah.
especially the traditions that think, oh, in order, if it's real authentic prayer, it's obviously spontaneous,
Right. Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
and that kind of thing. One of the cool gifts you mentioned earlier in the Episcopal tradition is a book, is a prayer book.
Yeah.
But because when you pick it up and your mouth joins the making the words, millions of people have
For
over years,
centuries. Yeah.
right? Then in some sense, you're going, I know there's something I need to attune to.
Yep.
I don't have the words for it.
Yeah.
And I don't have, my radar attuned in the moment.
Right.
So I'm trusting this tradition,
Yeah.
to make space for it to become possible.
Yeah.
Right. And as clergy, we know, like, if you ask us, like, when do you know if worship went well? It's like, it went well if during the week the experience of being there,
Yeah.
right, like, raised you and the congregation's awareness of the divine call moment to moment in the
Yeah.
week.
Right.
Like, and so if people, one of the perks, I think, of something like the app, something like a prayer book,
Yeah.
and things is, if you've kind of disengaged because prayer was a threat or a
Yeah.
taunt
Oh,
and something,
gosh.
it's like a
Triggering.
it's a
Inherently
first step
triggering.
back to go, yeah, you don't have to generate it all right now yourself.
Yeah.
And
I
here's a
love
prayer
that.
from Athanasius.
Yeah, right. Right. And that to me, and that to me is one of the richest things. And again, there's lots of traditions that do this, but as an Episcopalian, um, when I was coming out of the PCA, I was completely burned out. My whole lens on life was changing. I felt like it was me on a boat by myself with a bunch of dead Catholic authors. Like, that was just like, and I felt like totally isolated. And I remember I went to the Episcopal Church, and when I was a kid, sometimes my parents would take me to the Episcopal Church, but then I was never a part of it. I went and sat in the back of this Episcopal church, and these prayers that were said that I remembered
Mhm.
from being a child. And one of the things that struck me too, that set me free, is in the PCA, it was very much a pulpit centric, sermon centric church. And in that, the high watermark was not the sermon. The high watermark was the Eucharist. The high
Right.
watermark was this experience of you and the divine and community. But what struck me as I sat there, like, looking like a madman, I was in the very back bench, weeping, ugly crying at this absolute beauty of these ancient prayers washing over me. And it wasn't me manufacturing. It wasn't me working hard. It was, to me, it felt like the earth receiving rain. It just felt like balm and saturation and healing, that it wasn't performative, and it wasn't effortful. It was joining in with the expressions of so many other spiritual pilgrims that have been walking this path for centuries and centuries. And I knew even that morning that up and down the East Coast, that there were hundreds of thousands of people all saying this at the same time. And there was something about, again, that community experience and that expression when, I don't have words, but boy, this is a gorgeous expression. And so I do believe, especially in the app, if you, like, for me, when I hear adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, I still, to this day, I'm 50 and I'm still like, ugh, like it's triggering to me to this day. But when I found people kind of inviting me, not so much into performative action or pressured based action, but to simply step off the hamster wheel and step out of autopilot and land in this moment. And that's what spiritual practice does, and the ones we have on the app do. It just is a real gentle reorientation, and to me, it was profoundly healing. If it weren't for me, I found Second Breath in about 2008. And if it weren't for Second Breath, I totally would have thrown the towel on ministry, and probably my towel on faith.
Yeah.
But I experienced this whole new expression of Christian spirituality that was so vital and welcoming, actually encourage you to think and use your mind, and genuinely compassionate and loving. If it weren't for that, I think I just would have remained, a bitter, triggered, anti-Christian, instead of the direction it went.
All right. Next question, Mark. This one's about Advent. New to Advent, how did y'all first come to know about it? How do you see it now?
Interesting. Do you want to take a first swing at that? And
well, let's see. I mean, I was a Baptist preacher's kid, so Advent not a thing you do. You do Christmas for all of Advent, and then the 12 days of Christmas, you're like, what is this?
What is the 12 days?
So the church calendar, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas is a different season than Christmastide, the 12 days of Christmas, which starts at Christmas, ends at Epiphany, where you celebrate the Magi, the wise men, that whole story. So I learned it when when you grow up Baptist, but you also don't want to work at a church where by osmosis your child would end up having to debate whether everyone's welcome, or caring about justice things and all that kind of stuff. There's not a lot of Baptist churches that you can go to. So I started working at a Disciples of Christ church, and very early on, when worship planning meeting and you're looking over the yearly thing, they're like, it's Advent. What are we going to do at Advent? And I'm like, what is an Advent?
What's an Advent? And is that wreath? I have one of those.
I've seen those.
I've seen those.
So that was the introduction. And because, I came into it, and they're like, you should probably figure it out, because you're going to be in charge of the family craft gathering where you build Advent wreaths, and then writing to the devotional. Like, as a super nerd, I just started reading about it, and I was like, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Because underneath Advent is it's a recognition that just like the anticipation of think of the people of Israel under Roman occupation, where the large where the temple is being run by religious leaders who are intimately connected to Rome, where like you're sitting there going, the technical figures of institution, society, and culture are either learning to comply with this foreign domination system, and those who are rebelling against it have no space of power, and they're in the outside, like the Pharisees, right, are kind of rural, predominantly rural religious leaders. And so like you start to hear like in that context, how would you look at the world when history does not testify to the God of love and justice? Then you want to go, why? Where are you? And these kind of cries and longings that if you take time to think, what would a world look like if God's will was being done, and what is it compared to your world? There's this gap that makes you go, come God, where are you? Right? And so for the church, the Christian church, the recognition that God's response was not to install a new Caesar who would be the benevolent power monger, That was not to fulfill a particular religious tradition, tell everyone this is the one true one, you got to get on board. Like if it wasn't all these other kinds of dominating things, it was the gift of the divine life to finite flesh. And that's where the invasion of the divine subversion of powers and principalities happens. Like that's such it's cool thing. But it just like in that time, you have to pause and reflect on the gap.
Right.
Advent is one of those seasons where we join the groaning of creation, where we join the cries for justice, and we go, don't just start celebrating, learn to wait. And in your waiting, you learn to see and understand the distance between the world God dreams of and the world that's there. And it's in that space that Christ is born, in a manger, in Mary, but also within us, hopefully as the body of Christ, and in partnership with people of the Spirit in other traditions. And so for me, Advent became this time where the anticipation of Christmas is something that begs us to attend to the particularities of our time in history and go, what would the coming of God look like here? And how can we anticipate it and celebrate it and hopefully attune ourselves to participate with it?
I think that's beautiful. And that's a historical expression as well of its evolution. Same with me in the PCA. I didn't know anything about it. I was first, I left the PCA and I was running a nonprofit, and Episcopal Church contracted through that nonprofit for me to do some help out. They had a crisis with their youth ministry, and the parents were upset and youth volunteers were. So my very first Sunday that I was helping out was to create Advent wreaths. Which I was, aware of that. Apparently, it's the doorway.
It's the gateway drug.
It's the gateway drug to
for
deeper Advent.
For evangelicals to get really
evangelicals
to learn about mainline Protestantism. They're like,
and so I was like,
a wreath, and
all right,
there's 4
purple,
candles.
there's white candles, there's purple ones,
there's a random pink one.
There's a, what is this? All right, there's a random pink one. So
is that the second or the third week?
That was it. I didn't know. And then, of course, in my Episcopal formation, learning so much more about it. But again, kind of on the macro level, like you're describing, those come thou long expected Jesus. It's acknowledging this complexity of that, as I said earlier, that we are immersed in divine love and presence, that there's no separation.
Mm-hmm.
Separation is simply a delusion. And simultaneously, there is so much suffering, so much injustice, so much darkness. And it's a space for us to enter into that complexity and allow ourselves to sit in that tension. And I believe that on the macro level of the world. I believe it on the slightly smaller level of our country, down to our states and cities, down to our family systems, and then down even to our internal own dissonance as we wrestle with. I mean, one thing, even in my own life, I just find myself, even after all these years of spiritual practice, sometimes I can find myself almost weaponizing spiritual practice to be more about escaping my pain, just to try to reach this. Because I can do it with a certain breath work and all my years of meditation. I can just kind of take a bliss trip and I can kind of check out and go into this little quiet little space. And while occasionally that's fine, they're not to be escapist in nature. And what I do is I'm realizing I'm trying to kind of get out of the struggles of this human life and the struggles of being a messy person and just a human being. And the invitation during Advent is realizing that so often as I'm trying to escape up and out of this human experience, that Jesus in the incarnation is passing me, going down and into the very human condition that I'm trying to escape. And then there's this invitation then to open up to what it means to be fully present. And again, I think the invitation is that experience on every level. And that just makes then, when we get to Christmas, on a real level, that much more of a joyous celebration, as we emphasize not only the complexity, but here's all this tremendous beauty and hope. And that's not just esoteric. That's not just theological brain candy. But when we actually let that soak into our bones, that changes the way we interact with every second of every day.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the last question, and there were a number of variations on this. But I think it could be helpful, especially for people that knowing how many people are coming from different places. There are a couple of questions that said, how do you relate to broadly the Christian tradition, but also like the specificities on it when you aren't really sure about any of it. And there was one that said, like, you're doing a class with John Dominic Crossan, who not going to affirm supernatural baby conception as the likely historical. They like what's going on when you also are doing these things. And I get how certain people's religious upbringing leads them to think you would never use Christian myths, stories, narratives if you're being rational and reasonable. But I think one which leads to hesitations, right? Like, so if you aren't sure and you think I have to say X, Y, and Z to join, then what do you do? So what is the how do you see the gift of a wisdom tradition? Like in the gift of Advent from the Christian tradition, when you aren't sure that you could even read the dotted lines, let alone sign whichever ones you think are necessary.
Yeah, and for me, again, as I talked about, just shifting away.
I know you're a heretic.
I'm a total heretic. But I think this is the as we have evangelicals.
I just wrote multiple books about Jesus to convince myself I wasn't.
Okay, good. So you feeling pretty solid this morning?
No, I don't know. It depends on who read it last. They're like, you wrote 250 pages to come out as a heretic. And then other people are like, this is way too Christian, Trip. I didn't know.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I love at Second Breath is that we do have such a variety of people coming that from conservative evangelicals to agnostics, atheists, and Buddhists and different traditions. And one of the things that we emphasize, and this is where we talk about the wisdom tradition. And if I could just nerd out for just a few seconds about kind of explaining what the wisdom tradition is, because I don't think it's very well known. Cynthia Bourgeault describes it as the missing puzzle piece that's fallen out of Christianity in the West. But in essence, 2,000 years ago, when the gospel started spreading outside of Jerusalem, of course, it went all directions. And it doesn't just, when it started spreading, it wasn't just this perfect form that would land in its perfect form in people's lives, that people were interpreting it through the cultural lenses from which they grew up in. So when it went west into Rome, it was primarily an Aristotelian lens, an understanding of the world through Plato, and so with the perfect ideal and the fallen creation, there's a gap between. So all of a sudden now, the emphasis is that Jesus is the bridge from the imperfect world to perfect ideal. And so the emphasis in the West for Jesus's salvation has always been soteriology, and how do we bridge that gap? And I'm not minimizing that, but that is primarily in the West the emphasis of theology. And a case is made here by Cynthia Bourgeault in her book, The Wisdom Jesus, that I think is fairly compelling. But the gospel also went east. And in the East, the emphasis so much wasn't soteriology, but what they describe as sophiology, which has come the Greek word sophia, which means wisdom. That the emphasis in the East was not so much where do I go after I die, but how do I live fully in this life? And so Bourgeault makes the case that Jesus was a teacher in the wisdom tradition, which was not about primarily imparting facts and trying to download creedal positions, but about assessing someone's existing worldview, seeing where it was limited and constraining them, and then pretty much putting a stick in the spoke so they'd fly over the handlebars of their existing worldview and open up to a whole new lens that he called the kingdom of God. And so that's where he would say to the rich young ruler, go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Or he would say to Zacchaeus, come down out of that tree, we're gonna have lunch together. Or to the Pharisees, your whitewashed tomb with dead men's bones. Each one was like a stick in the spokes of their constrained worldview, inviting them to something more. So what we talk about, understanding Jesus as a wisdom teacher, is in no way minimizing the Jesus that someone might be more familiar with, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, but it's opening up to realize the only important thing that happened in the New Testament wasn't when Jesus died on the cross, that he has all these amazing teachings and livings, and it's to experience fullness of life now. So that's what we emphasize in the wisdom tradition and through these practices, that you don't have to, if you're coming from more of the evangelical background and you're concerned about, are you going to sign off on these beliefs? I'm not going to join unless it looks like this. We're not minimizing this. And you don't have to, you don't have to sign up on something heretical to join this. Yeah. Or if you're where I was at the time in many ways, where I was like, if you say, any of these creedal positions, it's going to trigger me and I'm out. That really is an invitation to a whole new expansive expression of understanding the life of Jesus of Nazareth, to really experience fullness of life now. So that's where I would say the heart of it is, that there's no creedal line to sign here. it's an experience to see what Jesus taught and embodied and follow in those footsteps.
Okay, so the prior to going moving back to the States and doing all the podcast related things all the time, my job was teaching philosophy of religion, and which means you're looking at the diversity of religious traditions and thinking philosophically
Right.
about the big questions humans have asked in different some of them unique to particular cultures, and some in some sense are generated by our finitude, the nature of language and such. So the big questions get answered by different religious traditions. One of the ways I described religious traditions in the classes, especially where you have multiple religious traditions present and people that are anti-religious or just like, I didn't grow up with any of this, was that a religious tradition is a wisdom tradition in that just to look at its history, it has enabled the cooperation and flourishing of life in all sorts of ways that were necessary for humanity to get to this spot in our collective ongoing evolution. Every wisdom tradition has times and places and communities where it is healthier and more toxic than others. But the only reason they existed, without saying anything about ultimate reality, is because those communities were a series of mythopoetic structures, but rituals and narratives and things that actually helped human beings wrestle in community with those questions that we've asked as a species around campfires since day one.
Right. Exactly.
And so they're like, just in some sense objectively, right? Like, just to talk about a tradition, it has a wisdom in it that has helped the flourishing of human beings enough that they invested in it, preserved it, built cathedrals, funded things, all these other kinds of stuff. Yeah, there's bad sides to it. So we can, if pointing out the bad sides means you get rid of large institutions, then start with capitalism. Anyway, sorry.
Side note.
But it's so one of the things you learn about any wisdom tradition is to understand them takes a different kind of knowing than you get at knowing a science. So like, my job was science and religion, taught philosophy of religion and taught the biological and brain sciences and religion.
Nice.
So if you wanted to understand how evolution works, there are mechanisms and they function biologically across species and contexts, and we can do all sorts of tests, and it should be repeatable in one place.
Right.
And then you could be able to learn it, and we can communicate, and we get better over time, figure stuff out. But that's very different. That is the epistemology, the kind of knowing, is a distanced one.
Yep.
And that is different than what happens in a wisdom tradition.
Right.
A wisdom tradition is an entangled wisdom. It is an intimate wisdom. The kind of knowing is much closer to knowing a love poem was written for you than knowing a syllogism, a logical syllogism is true.
That's a great distinction. That's a great articulation of the difference.
So if we want to say, and this is what I did for years until, for other reasons, I came back to having a lot more confidence in an ultimate reality of sorts, is you can bracket the objective at a distance type of question about God, or bracket the questions about what do we even mean by virgin conception or whatever. You can bracket those questions and then go, what gift has this tradition given the community that invest in these stories, so that they learned to, I don't know, let the same mind be in them as Christ Jesus, to let let their own hearts conceive of the word of God and it become flesh in their living. So if you see the wisdom of a religious tradition as something that you get at by knowing intimately, one possibility or one way of thinking about Advent and these particular practices is I'm going to spend a month dating the wisdom of the liturgical calendar and the season, because I don't actually have I don't know what it would mean to affirm these things in some objective way under modern notions of truth.
Right.
But you could learn the wisdom. And a lot of people, I think, when our brains have been so shaped by that kind of intellectualizing and when it goes to religion and spirituality, fetishizing the kind of authority science has,
Yeah.
is that we then see the invitation of religious traditions coming to you and going, well, we're going to demonstrate our truth are the same kind as these.
Right.
But what if they're different? Right. And I think Thom does a great job talking about these as parabolic overtures and stuff. But if we think of just the possible invitation for those that have no interest in belonging in a religious community or have baggage with the Christian community, there could be a wisdom Advent gives that you could encounter or attempt to taste by hanging out with us.
Right.
And at no point will we have an aisle for anyone to walk on.
There will be no aisle.
No,
there will be no heads bowed and eyes closed.
Well, they might have
they
eyes
might
closed.
Have,
I mean, there's
maybe,
the app.
Yeah, but no hands raised. To see how many people got saved.
Oh, okay. Because
but somebody might raise their hand. That's occasionally I do that, even as an Episcopalian.
But I think one of the things that's cool about that, like, and when you were talking about the way Second Breath both goes and says there's this rich wisdom in the Christian tradition,
right? And
then there are these things we're discovering about how the
brain body works and how we are, just how we've evolved and who we are.
Teresa of Avila had no access to brain scans,
right,
or the cognitive mechanisms we've learned to develop or anything,
right.
And yet there is a wisdom within her teaching,
right,
that then we come to understand in a different way.
Yeah.
Right. And so can you get to that wisdom without any of the traditions? Perhaps. But one of the gifts a tradition gives are a series of stories, rituals, practices that help you experience its affirmations rather than just assent to
mere intellectual assent. Exactly. Yeah, I love that. It's really, again, it's in that language of Rohr, and this is how he defined a mystic, because the word mystic has baggage depending on your context, is woo-woo or what other things it might be, but he was simply defining a mystic again as someone who's shifted just from mere intellectual belief systems to an actual inner experience. And that's the difference you described between a love poem being written to you versus just a soliloquy or something to someone else that we're reading as an academic. Oh, that's what did Wordsworth have to say about that? And so to me, it takes it from the academic to the intimate, to the experiential. And it's in the experiential that we actually experience transformation.
Yeah.
And that to me is where understanding the love and joy and peace and all of these things begin to be more of an inner experience instead of just an academic concept. And that just changes us as people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, there we go. That was the invitation there, Greg.
Right on, man. Right on.
So everyone, join us, crossingthroughadvent.com. Go check the links. You can check out the app. We'll see what this guy, and especially for those of you that decide to join this little online experiment of sorts, the spiritual side of the Advent group, definitely reach out when you have questions.
Love to hear questions.
Thoughts, experiences, that kind of stuff. We're going to try doing a regular hang and invite y'all to participate. Obviously, well, I'm going to mess. If you listen to the end of this, you probably are interested in participating. But if you listen and you're like, I'm hate listening, I have no interest,
hate listening,
then don't feel obligated to join. But for those that have requested something like this, the last 15 classes, feel free to give input, because this is the first time both of us have tried. His and his team developed all the stuff with the app. We'll do gatherings and hang out. Like, how do you attempt some type of Advent-y spiritual experience for the interested in an online space?
Yep.
We don't know. This will guaranteed to be the best and the worst version of I've ever done.
At the same time.
Yeah, it's the only one.
The best and the worst out of the gate.
Next time, it would have to go up or down.
Hey, yep. Now we have a point of relativity, but right now we know it's going to be the best
and the worst. I love your optimism, Greg.
Thanks, man.